Glandular fever, also known as infectious mononucleosis, is one of the diseases they love to teach medical students about. Said to be caused by Epstein-Barr virus, the mythology that has been built up around this ubiquitous entity has elevated it to an almost unrivaled position. Apparently it infects almost every single one of us and passes around with the greatest of ease, even through a kiss. The number of diseases it is said to cause is growing by the day, but the best known remains glandular fever. In this video, we take a look at the alleged virus, the antibody test that has caused all sorts of crazy epidemiological claims, and what might actually be going on with the condition. Something is definitely amiss with the glandular fever story, and virology's supposed supervillain.
Cavendish's downfall began in 2017 after he was diagnosed with the Epstein-Barr virus. It prevented him from performing at the highest levels for over 2 years. In that period, he went through numerous bad experiences.
In 1993, my husband Mark, Bailey, not Cavendish, was 17 years old with a budding elite sports career. He represented New Zealand at cross-country running that year and was only a few years away from discovering his talents as a cyclist and duathlete. But then something went wrong. He was biking home from school one day and was reduced to half his usual speed. There was nothing he could do as he got passed by schoolgirls due to muscles that could no longer push the pedals with their usual power. That night he woke up in a sweat with a sore throat and informed his parents the next morning that he could not get out of bed due to overwhelming fatigue. They took his symptoms seriously, as Mark typically got up at 6 a.m. and completed tough training sessions in the dark before cycling to school. He went to see the local GP, who detected swollen neck glands, and within minutes of the consultation, a diagnosis of infectious mononucleosis or glandular fever was made. What followed was 3 months of overwhelming fatigue and sleeping around 16 hours a day. He was later informed that one of the members from his running club had sneakily used Mark's drink bottle while they were staying in a hotel for an out-of-town event. This particular person had been diagnosed with glandular fever earlier that year, and the implication was that he had, quote, infected Mark with Epstein-Barr virus through saliva on the bottle. It was a story that we all believed until 2020. The CDC states that infectious mononucleosis, also called mono, is a contagious disease. Epstein-Barr virus, EBV, is the most common cause of infectious mononucleosis, but other viruses can also cause this disease. It is common among teenagers and young adults, especially college students. At least 1 out of 4 teenagers and young adults who get infected with EBV will develop infectious mononucleosis. As we have come to expect, there are no references for how it is claimed that a virus or several viruses are the cause of the problem. Over to Wikipedia, and the infectious mononucleosis page states that infectious mononucleosis, also known as glandular fever, is an infection usually caused by the Epstein-Barr virus and provides 2 citations, both of which go to the CDC web pages we have just come from. Before we get into these scientific papers, we can see that the CDC grants all sorts of incredible powers to the alleged EBV, including the following. Number 1. Many people become infected with EBV in childhood. EBV infections in children usually do not cause symptoms, or the symptoms are not distinguishable from other mild, brief childhood illnesses. Number 2. EBV spreads most commonly through bodily fluids, especially saliva. However, EBV can also spread through blood and semen during sexual contact, blood transfusions, and organ transplantations. 3. Once the virus is in your body, it stays there in a latent, inactive state. If the virus reactivates, you can potentially spread EBV to others, no matter how much time has passed since the initial infection. And 4. About 90% of adults have antibodies that show that they have a current or past EBV infection. Although to the uninitiated this may appear like a great deal of information has been established about the quote virus, we will see that it is nothing of the sort. Such claims create unfalsifiable paradigms concerning non-specific clinical presentations, abilities to spread at any time, and positive antibody tests that almost everyone eventually has, regardless of whether they have ever had symptoms. It is something we have seen many times before when all observations are made to fit the hypothesis, because the hypothesis is asserted to be an established fact. A major problem with the viral hypothesis can be seen with the statement, mono is primarily diagnosed based on the symptoms and can be confirmed with blood tests for specific antibodies. However, the symptoms can be anything from nothing to severe fatigue and swollen glands. We will see the underlying fallacy regarding the use of antibodies as proof of a virus soon, but we have already seen them state that the vast majority of people eventually have a positive antibody assay at some point in their lives. I'll briefly mention the monospot test, which was once hailed as a key diagnostic test. However, by 1979, it was noticed that even within the virus-believing paradigm, other conditions could result in, quote, false positive monospot tests. In any case, the CDC now states that the monospot test is not recommended for general use. So let's turn our attention to the alleged virus. So-called EBV has a fairly extensive Wiki Wonka page listing notable aliases and affiliations, as well as abilities and first appearance. The character's origins were reported to be documented in an unclassified document titled Virus Particles and Cultured Lymphoblasts from Burkitt's Lymphoma, published in The Lancet in 1964. Firstly, we should note that there were actually 3 authors that wrote this paper: Anthony Epstein from Britain, Yvonne Barr from Ireland, and Bert Achong, a Trinidadian of Chinese descent. However, for unknown reasons, Achong was not given naming rights. The 1964 paper is actually very short and will not take us long to go through. The methodology simply involved electron microscopy of a lymphoblast cell line that had originally been taken from a Burkitt's lymphoma, a type of lymph system tumour. After maintaining the cell line in the laboratory for between 75 and 82 days, samples were taken for imaging. So to be clear, these are known to be abnormal and cancerous cells. But it's the 60s, and oncoviruses, that is supposed viruses that cause cancer, are all the rage. Everyone was scrambling to discover the next one, as they think they might find the cure for these cancers, or at least secure some big research grants. In fact, this paper was supported by the US Public Health Service and assisted by the British Empire Cancer Campaign. Back to the methods section, and it was the typical electron microscopy technique of adding chemicals, followed by centrifugation, dehydration, embedding the results in resin, and slicing very thinly before firing a high-energy beam right through it. Whether what's left has anything to do with living biology is a valid question, and if you haven't seen it, you can watch my video on electron microscopy, where I outline further limitations of the technique. The authors then declare that, in addition to their usual features, a small number of the cells contained particles with the characteristic morphology of a virus. Figures 1 and 2. This is a well-established technique used by virologists, and it is sometimes referred to as the point and declare maneuver. They are claiming that the vesicular structures here, labelled with a V, look like a virus, which later came to be known as Epstein-Barr virus. It is worth pausing here to expose the preposterous pseudoscience at play. In addition to the problems of the electron microscopy technique itself, some of the further issues are: 1. They started out with the idea that with regard to lymphoma, a, quote, transmissible vector-borne agent may be involved in causation, so we're looking to fulfill this presupposition rather than engage in healthy skepticism about any subsequent observations. 2. Related to point 1, it was not a blinded experiment, like June Almeida claiming to see, quote, coronaviruses for the first time in the same decade. The biased virus hunters used an unscientific approach. 3. This image shows dead tissue embedded in resin. It is not possible to determine that these structures are infectious, replicating, and disease-causing particles. There were no control experiments in place and no possibility of identifying a causative, independent variable. The entire premise for their claim that they found a virus appears to come back to their statement that the overall appearance of the virus resembled herpes simplex. However, the papers they refer to engaged in the same point and declare exercise. For example, this 1954 paper that performed electron microscopy on chicken embryos that were asserted at the start to be infected with viruses on the basis they used a, quote, stock laboratory strain originally obtained a number of years ago from the New York City Department of Health. Because putting a label on something makes it so in this paradigm. And here is what they claim are viruses, because they expected them to look like this. It's turtles all the way down. None of the particles have been shown to fulfill the definition of a virus. They just fulfill the imaginations of the virologists who decided in advance that they should look like this. They are simply looking at structures in a cell culture and making up a story without any proof this represents biological reality. However, once this is done for the first time, it sets the precedent, and other imagined viruses such as EBV are then claimed to have been visualized. You can also watch my video on herpes to see why earlier studies did not provide any evidence for a herpes simplex virus either. So how on earth did they go from this shady little 1964 paper that didn't show any virus to the claim that the non-existent virus was the cause of glandular fever? Through the magic of antibodies and possibly other influences of the decade. Epstein sent his cell line samples to the Henley team at the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia. The New England Journal of Medicine reported that the Henleys were searching for an illness caused by the newly discovered virus and were screening human serum samples for antibodies to viral capsid antigens. By a real stroke of luck, an answer came quite unexpectedly in August 1967 when a technician in their laboratory became ill with infectious mononucleosis. Again, they decided in advance that the technician had a, quote, infectious disease. Blood samples from the technician showed that they had developed antibodies, or at least an antibody assay reaction, and it was declared that these matched the, quote, viral capsid antigens. However, these proteins cannot be called viral because there was no virus demonstrated to begin with. Remember that all they had was a cell culture mixture, and these were simply some of the proteins that they detected in the mixture. As always, virology relies on circular reasoning, with a claim that viral antibodies are reacting with viral antigens. Once again, we point out to them, where is the virus? And this is the foundational basis to all subsequent claims that glandular fever is caused by the imagined EBV. In 1980, the Henleys wrote, "It seems difficult for some students of infectious diseases to visualize how the Epstein-Barr virus could be the cause of three quite disparate diseases, one benign, infectious mononucleosis, and two malignant Burkitt's lymphoma and nasopharyngeal carcinoma." Well, let's be honest, this was all completely made up. All they had was some proteins that are possibly found in higher quantities in these conditions, and all that can be said about them is that they are a reaction to or part of a healing response associated with multiple conditions. The same goes for the genetic sequences that were subsequently attributed to EBV. Hopefully you can see at this point the fictional world that has been built on the non-existent EBV. That is not a virus, if it even accurately depicts an entity in nature. It is something of unknown biological function. The antibody assays that are used around the world have not been matched to any virus, but return so many positive results that the virus hunters make fantastic claims about how it can cause all sorts of diseases, including stomach cancer, multiple sclerosis, and Parkinson's disease. Wikipedia states that nearly 95% of people have had an EBV infection by the time they are adults. The antibody results are also why Wikipedia makes the claim, mononucleosis most commonly affects those between the ages of 15 and 24 years in the developed world. In the developing world, people are more often infected in early childhood when there are fewer symptoms. Right, the imagined virus spreads around with the greatest of ease, but behaves differently depending on which neighbourhood it happens to be in. While this video is focused on glandular fever, what can we say about all of these claims? The most definitive thing is that they are not caused by a virus, and this is important for a number of reasons. Firstly, it is not contagious, as is widely claimed, and that is why they cannot show us the evidence in a human-to-human transmission paper. Instead, they published papers like this one in 2016, which surveyed undergraduate students and declared that the only significant risk factor for acquisition of EBV infection was deep kissing. Wow, imagine that! First-year university students engaged in kissing. This is what they cite as evidence because of the embarrassing lack of actual transmission experiments. Following on from this contagion fraud is another budding vaccine fraud, with Moderna starting EBV clinical trials in 2022. If you want to see how twisted this narrative gets, The Guardian gaslit the public after Moderna's announcement, reporting that in the 1980s, virologist Hank Balfour set his sights on developing a vaccine to prevent people from becoming infected with the virus. Over the next 30 years, his efforts would repeatedly be knocked back as pharmaceutical companies stalled and mulled over whether such a jab would be economical. But the advent of cheaper messenger RNA vaccine technology over the past 2 years and the discovery that EBV appears to be the main cause of MS has added new impetus for bringing such a vaccine to market.
Sponsored by Pfizer.
They went on to report that Moderna's clinical trial is targeting people in the 18 to 30 age range. But given that so many people contract EBV as children, the ultimate aim is to administer the vaccine to infants. In other words, they are looking for the jackpot by jostling their way into the already jam-packed childhood vaccination schedule. This will be sold as the way to prevent all of the claimed diseases associated with a claimed virus that apparently affects us all. When it comes to glandular fever, there is no it. The appearance of an it has only been created by an antibody assay, which ends up being positive in the majority of people at some time in their life. The antibody assay can be associated with no symptoms at all, or the classic fever, sore throat, swollen glands, and fatigue. In other words, the test is a waste of time and will make no difference to management, so do not subject yourself to one. As always, the condition of the body is a manifestation of what it is trying to do. In developed countries, the condition known as infectious mono or glandular fever often happens during adolescence. It is a watershed period for many of us, marking the end of childhood and the abrupt process of becoming an adult. The stress during this time is probably underestimated as we go from being a dependent in relatively sheltered environments to sudden independence and all the responsibilities that come with it. I know from personal experience that university students classically engage in toxic lifestyles involving alcohol, parties, poor quality food, late nights, cramming for exams, competing for grades, financial stress, and unstable relationships. Other adolescents take on abrupt increase in workloads or training schedules that perhaps their bodies need longer to adapt to. Of historical note, the syndrome known as glandular fever was not even described until the end of the 19th century. As always, the most important thing to do is reverse all of the identified underlying erroneous lifestyle practices and allow the body to complete its healing. Thankfully, the mainstream medical system doesn't routinely interfere with this condition, although paracetamol and anti-inflammatories, such as ibuprofen, may be recommended to reduce fever. I would advise strongly against this practice because it suppresses the body's eliminatory process. You can watch my video on fever for more information about this. If sore throat is prominent, then a brief fast may be indicated with plenty of dilute citrus drinks. The mainstream may sometimes advise antibiotics on the unscientific premise that there is also a, quote, bacterial secondary infection at play. Do not take antibiotics under any circumstances, and please watch my video on Group A strep where I explain more about this. If a period of fatigue is experienced, then after a fast, a build-up phase may be required. This could include raw milk, bone broths, and spending some time outside in the sun each day. A full recovery is expected, and hopefully some lessons have been learnt about how to stay healthy in the future. Perhaps on a deeper level, we need to think more about how we help adolescents prepare themselves and make the transition into adulthood. More extensive information can be found in our other publications, such as Terrain Therapy, and we often discuss these themes in our bi-monthly Q&A sessions, where I hope you can join us. Symptoms are of dual significance. They are nature's warnings of deflection from the law. They are also evidence of nature's method of cure. In either case, the more effectively we suppress them, without adequate attention to the underlying disease process and the causes that brought it about, the more effectually may we prevent nature from achieving her beneficent purpose of protecting us from the consequences of ignorance and neglect. Dr. Ulrich Williams, Terrain Therapy. If you enjoyed this video, please visit supportdrsam.com